Welcome to the Egg on Air live session with Christopher Peter MAKRIS. My name is Katie Grasso, Content Marketing Manager at Dataiku, and I'm thrilled to introduce Christopher Peter as he discusses statistical paradoxes and logical fallacies without using a single mathematical equation. Christopher Peter, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. So before we dive into Christopher Peter's talk, I wanted to share a bit about his many accomplishments and what he was up to prior to joining Dataiku. At Dataiku, Christopher Peter MAKRIS, also known as CPM, is a technical lead responsible for scoping client projects, assuring quality of deliverables, and professionally developing a team of data scientists. He also stands as a co-host for our own Banana Data podcast, debating topics among the data science ecosystem, including responsible and ethical AI. Prior to Dataiku, CPM had served as a director of data science in both industry and academia, not only writing code to solve complex problems firsthand, but also advising others upon the technical and non-technical skills necessary to be a successful data scientist. His list of accomplishments goes on, but I know you're all eager to hear from him. So, Christopher Peter, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Katie, for the absolutely wonderful introduction. Let me just take a brief moment to share my screen here and verify that you guys can see the slides. And we'll hop right in. The title slide visible? Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. So let's get started. First of all, I am so excited to present today for the Egg on Air conference. I've enjoyed all the discussions, webinars, and masterclasses thus far, and I'm honored to contribute today, albeit in a slightly different setting. I'm typically used to seeing my audience either in a conference room or lecture hall, so it's definitely much harder to pick up on the social cues, but we're all in this together. Along the way, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat because we'll reserve some time at the end for an open forum. But for now, let's dive right in. Today, we'll be talking about statistical paradoxes and logical fallacies. Don't believe the lies your data tells. And I hate to admit it, but your data is lying to you. And more often than you think. Having clean data with high volume, velocity, and variety doesn't necessarily protect one from the possibility of reaching spurious conclusions to research questions of interest. Despite what you might have learned in Statistics 101, a statistical significant p-value isn't always groundbreaking. All data can be coerced and bribed to tell any story. Thus, it's our job as data practitioners to be cognizant of the possible pitfalls that abound and how to navigate around those common traps responsibly. I know I had the wonderful introduction from Katie moments ago, but I wanted to give you a bit more context to my background in the field of data science. I studied logic, discrete mathematics, and statistics, and I bring experience from both industry and academia. I previously stood as the director of data science for the New York City Data Science Academy and executive director for the Masters of Statistical Practice program at Carnegie Mellon University. And at both institutions, I took pride in professionally developing students, aiding in the redesign of technical curricula, and delivering over 3,000 hours of lectures to graduate student audiences. On the other hand, in industry, I most recently helped thwart cybercrime as the director of security data science at Empower Retirement. And through a lot of serendipity, I ended up here at Dataiku as a lead data scientist. And from the bottom of my heart, I've never been happier to be a part of a team with colleagues around the globe that fascinate me every single day. So let me start with a couple fun facts about me. When I'm not crunching numbers on my computer, I'm crunching my abs in the studio as I'm an avid dancer, choreographer, and CrossFitter, which explains even why I consider myself a data scientist. I really can only count to 5, 6, 7, 8, and add and subtract in multiples of 5. Now, weightlifting barbells does provide a massive adrenaline rush for me every morning at 5:30 a.m., but nothing truly gets my blood pumping like presenting to a team. It turns out that my average heart rate tends to be on par or even higher when teaching than during my morning workouts. So this is a screenshot of my heart rate data during a semester where I taught 9 a.m. classes at CMU. So just imagine the heart palpitations I'm having right now while presenting in front of all of you today. All right, so that's enough about me. Today, we're supposed to be taking a tour of a handful of statistical paradoxes without encountering a single mathematical equation. But I have to be honest, this is truly a misnamed presentation. Instead, this talk should really be called Statistical Not So Paradoxes, because we're really not discussing any true paradoxes at all. And what do I mean by that? The paradoxes we will discuss are not truly self-contradictory, but rather they're unintuitive findings. So take, for example, this sentence. This statement is false. Well, this is actually a true paradox because it is self-contradictory and self-referential. Suppose that the statement is true, then it must be false, which leads us to a contradiction. And suppose that the statement is false, well, then it must be true, which also leads us to a contradiction. So this is a true paradox, but this is not the type of paradox we'll be discussing today. Instead, we'll be discussing unintuitive findings based on perspective. So here, take, for example, these two gentlemen having a debate about the image they see in front of them. You can consider that image their data. So who is right? Who is wrong? Well, neither gentleman is technically incorrect. They're simply taking the information presented in front of them from their own frame of reference and communicating the results to each other. We do very much the same thing as data scientists when we're interpreting data. And in that vein, the impetus behind this presentation is to highlight that it is very easy to lie by telling the truth. If I'm looking at these gentlemen's data with this image on the floor, and I have some ulterior motive, I may choose to present that the symbol is a 6 rather than a 9. But that subjective choice paired with my own bias may be telling a story that is truly misleading, either unintentionally or intentionally. So I have a quote here from Winston S. Churchill that is a bit of a joke, but I think the point is quite valid. He says, "Do not trust any statistics you did not fake yourself." And I think it gets across the concept of lying by telling the truth, especially with data. So what should we do? The best way to protect ourselves from these types of problems is to be aware of them, know what to be on the lookout for, and know the right types of questions to ask. The discussion topics today we'll be talking about span a range of items, and we'll delve into 3 paradoxes in particular: Simpson's paradox, regression toward the mean, and statistical versus practical significance. Now, trust me, if this is just gibberish and jargon at this point, do not fret. I'll make sure to highlight the bottom line along the way as we go on this tour together. So let's hop right in. The first topic we'll be discussing today is Simpson's paradox, and it's named after a gentleman by the name of Edward H. Simpson, who first described this phenomenon in a technical paper in 1951. However, Pearson, Ewell, and other statisticians mentioned similar effects in writings as early as 1899. The 2 main research questions of interest that we'll answer via this paradox are, is more data better? And how can the inclusion or exclusion of data obfuscate a previously held conclusion? Nowadays, we often hear of the concept of streaming data or big data, and that more is always, always better. However, I've always been a big believer that in the notion that it's not always the volume of the data that matters, but the collection of the right data that matters. That's a whole topic of discussion in and of itself, but when we're building statistical and machine learning models of phenomena in the world, the concept of garbage in, garbage out always applies. Furthermore, computers are a little bit dumb. They'll do what we tell them to do without questioning, even if the process itself is illogical. So we as human beings must stand as a filter for reaching these spurious conclusions or faulty analyses. But how can it be possible to flip a previously held conclusion about which we're pretty confident? You might ask, if there's only one manifestation of a process in the world, how can there be conflicting conclusions regarding that mechanism at play? So to investigate this and other paradoxes today, let's pretend that we're a professor at a university teaching a very large class. Now, this lecture we are teaching is very, very large. It actually has a few hundred students, and is part of the general education requirements in order to graduate. So many students across the university will be taking this class. And today is a special day because we are administering a big exam. One question that we might want to ask is, what is the relationship between time spent studying and exam score? Now, just using our own intuition and experience, we might assume that the association is positive, meaning that students who study very diligently and hard are more likely to have a higher score on their exam. And similarly, we might assume that students who don't study very much or are distracted or not as diligent in their study tactics are more likely to have a lower score. So if we graph these 2 variables against one another, where we have the number of hours studied on the x-axis and the student exam scores on the y-axis, we should expect to see an upward trending association. Now remember that this is a fictitious example that's slightly contrived for these illustration purposes, but let's suppose that once we've graded the exams, it turns out that the observed association is completely unexpected. The association between studying and score is completely flipped from what we hypothesized. We actually find that the more a student studies, the lower their score, and vice versa. How can this be possible? What is going on? If we return to our research question of interest, we asked, what is the relationship between time spent studying and exam score? And came to find that for our exam, this is completely flipped from our hypothesis. But we're pretty confident that this is completely unintuitive. In the grand scheme of things, studying for an exam shouldn't reduce the average expected score. So what's going on? Let's return to our lecture hall once again. Maybe there are other variables at play here that we didn't consider before. Remember, this is a large lecture applicable to many students across the university. It turns out that since this is a large lecture, there are students across various seniority levels attending. Maybe it's the case that this level of experience or seniority has something to do with how the students study or perform on exams in general. Once again, this is a little bit of a joke and a funny meme on how freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors study and do their homework on the weekend, but I think it drives the point home. Maybe freshman students have to put in a lot more work because of their unfamiliarity of the lecture style, or haven't yet formed the study habits that best work for them in college. On the flip side, maybe more senior students are used to the college style of learning and already know the most efficient study habits that work for themselves as individuals. So if we return back to our exam data, and now break this out by grade level, we see a very different story emerging. In aggregate, when we considered the association between hours studied and exam score, we saw a grand inverse relationship. However, when considering the subgroups based upon grade level, in general, given a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, the more they study, the higher their average score tends to be. The association is completely flipped. Now, this was a fake example, but Simpson's paradox manifests within various industries in many real-world scenarios. At UC Berkeley in 1973, there was a very famous study surrounding gender bias in graduate admissions. The admissions figures displayed that, in general, men applying were more likely than women to be admitted. However, it turns out that women tended to apply to more competitive departments with lower rates of admission even among the qualified applicants, such as the English department, whereas men tended to apply to less competitive departments with higher rates of admission among the qualified applicants, like the engineering and chemistry departments. So when parsed by department, the data showed that women were more likely to be admitted, whereas in general, the frequency of men being admitted was higher. The paradox also appears in the medical industry, and in particular for the treatment of kidney stones. A real study in 1986 compared the success rates of two procedures for treating kidney stones, one that was more invasive, costly, painful, and generally successful than the other. And the key question here was which procedure was better? It turns out that there was a confounding variable here, which was the severity of the case itself, or the size of the kidney stones. So despite the treatment method in general, larger kidney stones are just simply harder to cure. And thus doctors tended to suggest the more invasive procedure for the more severe cases. Thus, the procedure that we consider more successful changes depending on this perspective in light of this new information. The paradox also appears in entertainment. So for example, when we consider the batting averages of Derek Jeter of the New York Yankees and David Justice of the Atlanta Braves in the years of 1995 and 96, we see Simpson's paradox arising. In aggregate, Derek Jeter seems to outperform, but conversely, if we look at each individual year, David Justice actually has a better batting average. And lastly, one more example, we also observe Simpson's paradox arising occasionally in the field of law. In counties of Florida in 1976 and 77, there seemed to be racial disparity in the application of the death penalty. One conclusion was based on data aggregated by the race of the defendant, yet the opposite conclusion was reached when considering the data parsed by the race of the victim. So in general, regardless of the question or the industry, it's important to keep this at the forefront of our minds when we are drawing possibly impactful conclusions during data analyses. Depending on how someone presents their data, they may be able to tell the story that they want to tell, which certainly can raise deep and ethical concerns. So how do we protect ourselves? If we return to our research questions of interest, how do we answer them? Well, truthfully, we're really not sure because it depends on every single situation. If we add more data or split into groups based upon a new variable, then that can possibly be informative, but alternatively, it could be the case that the subgroups in consideration are just arbitrary and therefore lead us to spurious conclusions. We must also consider common notions of data analysis, such as correlation does not imply causation, or other familiar adages that we've heard time and time again. Is the variable I'm considering likely directly associated with the conclusion I'm trying to draw? And how do I know? Once again, this is a whole discussion in and of itself. But what should we do? When facing Simpson's paradox, we need to consider the context. In particular, we should carefully analyze the situations described by the statistics and consider whether or not there are any latent or hidden variables. And additionally, we need to consider the decision process by which we are drawing these conclusions. Ideally, the explanation of the process would be logical, tangible, and understandable in a way that seems to make intuitive sense. So for example, with our exam score scenario, a subgroup analysis based on student seniority was appropriate as a consideration of a latent variable. Whereas with the kidney stones, the size and severity induced bias in the decision-making process that doctors took in assigning treatments to patients. So an aggregation may make more sense in context. Now, as a side note, it is important to highlight that these scenarios and experiments were not really true experiments, where we have a control group and an experimental setup and so on and so forth. But rather, these are strictly observational studies. So the conclusions of association are certainly not as strong. And that's really basically the statistician's way of protecting themselves and saying allegedly. But really, it's a way of highlighting the uncertainty and truthfulness of our claims. The bottom line here is that whenever Simpson's paradox arises, it is always important to consider the context and be aware that someone might be able to lie by telling the truth. Now, I could talk about Simpson's paradox all day, but in the interest of time, I'd like to continue our tour and move on to the next paradox, which is regression toward the mean. Now, with regression toward the mean, the two questions that arise are, is an observed event truly a trend? And how can previously noted behaviors be a marker for the complete opposite behavior in the future? If I see a phenomenon being performed once, should I expect that phenomenon to happen again? Is it truly a trend? Maybe something else is at play. In order to investigate regression towards the mean, let's return once again to our class of students in that big lecture hall. Now, let's be honest, our students are probably pretty fatigued. They've been listening to us talk all day about statistical paradoxes, and they even took that exam on the previous day. At least we've been a bit of a good professor and have already graded their exams pretty swiftly. So let's take a look at the distribution of their scores. Typically, exam scores follow a normal or a Gaussian shape, which is represented here by what's commonly known as a bell curve. On the x-axis, we'll have the student scores, and the low and high performers will be towards the edges of the tails of this distribution. We can see that for this exam, the low scorers barely passed or maybe even failed. And the high scorers got nearly a perfect score or even got a little bit of extra credit. So let's suppose we do something interesting. And as a fair warning, we're kind of a little bit of a weird professor here in this example. Let's take all the exceptionally good and bad students and give them feedback based on their performance. Remember, this is just an example for illustration purposes, so I'm not actually advising doing this in real life. But let's say we take the high-performing 10% of students and bring them into our office and tell them, congratulations, you were the top scoring students. We are very, very proud of you and all of your achievements and accolades. If you keep it up, you're going to perform at the top of your class. On the flip side, let's say we take the low-performing 10% of students, bring them into our office, and scold and reprimand them. We'll tell them, you didn't do well enough. We're not proud of your performance, and if you keep it up, you will be a failure and just not graduate. We're pretty harsh here, but honestly, that's just the half of it. The next day, when the students arrive to their lecture, little do they know that we're truly an evil, evil professor. And today they're in for a surprise. And that surprise is a pop quiz. This pop quiz is very similar to the exam the students recently took. It's on the same material and the same topics, but with slightly different questions. Maybe it's a math test that is testing the same material, but the numbers are slightly different. We'll assume that the students really didn't have any additional time to study than they did for the first exam. After all, they really weren't expecting a pop quiz in the first place. So basically, we can consider it pretty much the exact same exam, but a second time around. So let's see what happens. If we remember the distribution of scores on the first exam, we had low and high performers on the extremes who received negative and positive feedback respectively. When the low-performing students took the pop quiz, their score ended up being higher than their first examination. Conversely, when the high-performing students took the pop quiz, their score ended up being lower than their first examination. Ultimately, the students at both ends of the extreme for the first exam ended up performing more like average students on the pop quiz. We would say that they regressed towards the mean. Once again, we might ask ourselves the question, what's going on? Specifically, we might ask ourselves, what is the relationship between this feedback delivery and the student's performance? Did praise truly influence the great students to get lazy and reduce their score? Did scolding end up motivating underperforming students to study harder and increase their score? Can we really claim that praise or scolding affects the student's score? Once again, what is going on? All right, so let's take an extreme perspective here. Suppose that test scores are 100% based solely on luck. Let's look at this through the lens of a complete randomness using a little contraption called a Galton board. This device is named after Sir Francis Galton and approximates a normal or Gaussian distribution from a binomial with many trials. Essentially, there are thousands of tiny metal balls that all start at the top at the very same spot, and as they waterfall down and bounce around on these pegs, they have an equal likelihood with a 50-50 chance of falling to the left or to the right. Most will fall towards the center because that's the closest where they began, essentially the average of these 50-50 chances, but some will happen to fall at the very extremes. Now, this image is repeating on a loop, so it's always exactly the same, but imagine flipping this contraption over and over and over again. It'll pretty much always make the same familiar bell-shaped curve, approximately. Let's exclusively hone in on the low-scoring students, represented by the metal balls that are falling into the red band. Let's take only those metal balls and drop them down the Galton board a second time. What do you think will happen? Well, once again, some may end up on the extremes, but most will fall towards the middle. The same can be said if we exclusively hone in on the high-scoring students, represented by the green band. If it's all based on luck, you're far more likely to regress towards the mean on subsequent trials following an extreme occurrence. But realistic scenarios on regression towards the mean are rarely based solely in luck. In actuality, there is a dichotomy between chance, luck, variability, and error in measurement, and the skill, talent, and aptitude that we're trying to measure. If we think about the students who were low scorers, they actually fall into two main buckets: those who were unskilled and not unlucky, and those who were average students and just got unlucky for this exam. Similarly, if we think about the students who were high scorers, they fall into two main buckets: those who were skilled and not unlucky, and those who are truly average performers but just got lucky on this exam. If we return to those who were low scorers, the truly unskilled students have a second chance at being lucky when they're tested again, which would result in an increase in their score. And similarly, the truly average students will be unlikely to repeat their unlucky streak when they're tested again, which would also result in that increase in their score. A similar occurrence can be explained if we hone in on the high-performing students. The truly skilled students have a second chance at being unlucky when they're tested again, which means that that would decrease their score. And truly average students will be unlikely to repeat their lucky streak when they're tested again, which would also result in a decrease in their score. If we return back to our research questions of interest, we need to consider the process at hand. What can be explained or quantified by some measure of interest, for example, the skill, level, or aptitude of a student taking an exam? And what is the level of variability that is due to chance, or maybe a lurking variable like we saw before with Simpson's paradox? These are admittedly not easy questions to answer because they really depend upon the events at hand. Well, while this is once again a fictitious example, regression towards the mean truly manifests within various industries. So for the educational realm, the relationship between positive and negative feedback and performance was actually investigated with the training of Israeli fighter pilots. So this is not truly a fictitious example, but a paradoxical result that, in one light, could possibly negate years of research underscoring the effect of positive feedback in motivating others to succeed. And that's actually a tactic I personally take daily. But this phenomenon can really just be explained by regression towards the mean. In the medical industry, if a clinical trial suggests that a drug or treatment outperforms all treatments for a condition, then it is more likely it will perform closer to the average in the next trial. Once again, this reinforces the importance of a control group and all the concepts of experimental design, but as we mentioned earlier, that is definitely a discussion for another time. You might have heard of the jinx of the Sports Illustrated cover, where in entertainment, if a player appears on the cover of a magazine, then there's this narrative that surfaces about them in subsequent seasons where they're allegedly becoming too arrogant or that they broke under pressure and they just fell off their pedestal. There's this adage that says that it's hard to get on top, but it's even harder to stay on top. And while that does hold true here, it's often explained in part by the phenomenon of regression towards the mean. This also appears in entertainment with movies and music albums that have sequels that may not perform as well as the original. I think we've all probably heard at some point a friend saying to us that the original was so much better. And of course, a last example is with business performance and profits being considered quarter over quarter. A really fantastic or terrible quarter of profits tends to be followed by one that is more like the average. So the bottom line here is to be aware of this dichotomy between random variability, or the error of the process that we're trying to describe, and the actual performance, which is based on the metrics or the measures that we're attempting to quantify. Once again, I could talk about regression to the mean all day, but in the interest of time, let's turn our attention to our final paradox, which is statistical versus practical significance, which is actually a favorite of mine. And here, the two main research questions of interest we want to answer are, is an association worth my time? And when do incontrovertible conclusions lead us not to act on a valid association? Why would it be the case that we may identify that X is associated in a positive way with Y and an impactful way about which we care, but then we choose not to exploit it, implement it, or even use that knowledge at all? It seems pretty counterintuitive. So one last time, let's return to our classroom. And I can tell these students are really tired of us at this point because, we've been talking about statistical paradoxes here for about 25 minutes. But maybe we're truly not an evil professor any longer, and we just want to help the students learn the best way that they possibly can. So suppose we try to find out what works best for the students' study. Let's say we end up taking the students and split them into two different types of study groups to figure out which study tactic is the best. The first will go to normal recitations, where they review practice problems with a teaching assistant. And the other group will take specifically constructed practice exams from expensive review books with hundreds of pages. And as a side note, I personally remember having these stacks of books to review the SAT, the AP exams years ago, and they're really, really, really heavy. So when the students end up taking their exam, we once again can graph their scores and see a very familiar bell curve. However, when we split by study tactic, a slightly different story emerges. It seems as though, on average, students with the test prep books outperformed those in the recitation. And although this difference is detectable and statistically significantly detectable, there is so much overlap in these distributions of scores. We might ask ourselves, Is it truly valuable for students to go through the arduous process of buying these expensive books, lugging them around, and spending all the time to go through these tons of multiple choice review questions? Let's think about this a little bit more. It looks like the difference in the average score between the two groups is really, really small. And that's the distance between the two peaks of the curves. Said another way, if a student that is slightly better than average from the recitation group from the pink curve, their performance is better than most of the students in the test prep group in the blue. Similarly, a slightly worse than average student in the test prep group is outperformed by most of the students in the recitation group. So, although the difference is detectable between these two study tactics, and we can claim truthfully that on average, students with the test prep group in blue outperformed, are we truly going to act on this finding? Along with statistical significance, we need to assess the practicality of the evidence. And that practicality relies on our notion of the time, effort, and money we invest and the return on investment that we get. We've already seen this first scenario where the curves overlap quite a bit. But what about this alternate scenario where the curves are much more separated? Another concept that may help us assess the practicality of the evidence is that of confidence intervals. So for example, on the left, I might claim that we are 95% confident that the true average increase in score for students using the test prep book is between 1 and 3 points. We can claim that this is statistically significant, but is it worth it? I think most of us would agree, not really. In contrast, for the example on the right, I might claim that this average increase is about 15 points, maybe ranging most of the time between 5 and 25 points. Again, this is statistically significant, but we ask ourselves, is it worth it? In this case, we might say, yeah, possibly. The bottom line is that no matter what you heard in Stat 101, statistical significance isn't the only thing that should matter when we consider taking action on an association that we think is plausible and is supported by our data. As a brief aside, I wanted to comment upon a related idea that has to do with experimental design by a quote by Ronald Fisher, who was a British statistician of the 1900s. He said, "To call in the statistician after the experiment is done may be no more than asking him to perform a post-mortem examination. He may be able to say what the experiment died of." Why perform an experiment in the first place if we're not going to be able to detect or induce a change of magnitude about which we care? Why spend a lot of effort to set up an experiment just to find out the results were statistically insignificant, yet the experiment wasn't planned in a way that would provide statistical significance for the change about which we care in the first place? The bottom line here is to not be the victim of bad planning. On this subject, we could talk about power analysis, true positives versus false positives, reducing mean squared error variance, and so on and so forth, but that's not the point of this discussion. The last idea I'd like to make note of in studies like these is the concept of multiple testing, and to caution us against spurious conclusions brought on by experimenting just for experimentation's sake. Be aware of spurious conclusions brought on by multiple testing without penalty. And this concept is really complex, but it's best illustrated by my absolute favorite XKCD comic, which I'll briefly walk us through on the next slide. So here, someone runs into the room and shouts to the data scientists that they think jelly beans cause acne. And the data scientists conclude that there really isn't evidence to support that claim. But the person says that they hear it's only a certain color of jelly beans that causes acne. So the data scientists put down their Minecraft and they go ahead and investigate. They find no link between purple jelly beans and acne. No link between brown jelly beans and acne, pink, blue, and teal. They continue on with their studies and go with salmon, red, turquoise, magenta, and yellow jelly beans. Still no link to acne. They continue with beige, lilac, black, peach, and orange. Still no link between jelly beans and acne. And then they go through 5 more times. But in this 4th pane, notice, we found a link between green jelly beans and acne. So the next day, splashed across the front page of the paper, is this claim that green jelly beans are linked to acne, We are 95% confident, and there is only a 5% chance that this is coincidence. But is this really the case? Are these results reproducible and replicable? If we read a headline like this, we should have a healthy dose of skepticism. The data scientists tested 20 different jelly beans, each with a 5% chance of a false positive. One surfaced as statistically significant, which we would have expected if we knew the whole story and not just what was written in the newspaper headlines. Okay, but once again, what is the practicality of the evidence? It's actually quite irresponsible for articles or papers like this to be published without true candor and highlighting the true details of the entire study, where the public would be told that lots of tests were performed over and over and over again. Skilled data scientists know to employ corrections that have fancy names like Bonferroni, Tukey, Dunnett, and Chaffee to correct for these types of scenarios. But once again, that's a discussion for another time. If you return back to our research questions of interest once again, the bottom line is that it really depends on the practicality of the evidence. If we do come upon a statistically significant finding, we may not always act upon it because it might not be a truly valid association, or it may not even be worth our time in the first place. Lastly, statistical versus practical significance should be considered in many settings. We already saw an example here with the education industry with comparing exam scores and study tactics, but it also appears in the medical industry. When we think about clinical trials for weight loss, for example, it may be technically claimed that you can lose a pound or two very, very confidently, but that could be over the course of a very long time, and it may not be worth it to someone if the effort is really, really high that you have to put in. Or maybe there's a new drug that claims to reduce your blood pressure ever so slightly, but it comes with a lot of side effects. Would it be worth it to us? In most cases, probably not. In advertising, social media marketing campaigns might claim that they are successful because of a click rate being increased with a very small fraction of a percentage. It may not be worth it to completely change the code on a website, depending on the return on investment for that change, even if we're really sure that it does increase the click rate. This also appears in the social sciences, and specifically with a study on the behaviors of introverts versus extroverts. The differences appear with moderate activities like smiling at strangers, but behaviors that are the same tend to occur the same way at the extremes, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. So for example, getting stir crazy from being in quarantine for a few months is something that would happen for both introverts and extroverts, or being really uncomfortable in large crowds can similarly happen the same way. So no matter where you fall on the spectrum of being an introvert versus an extrovert, you may have this problem encountered by statistical versus practical significance coming into play. So in general, in all of these examples, the difference in the mean value is similar or smaller than the standard deviation of each group, meaning that there really is a large overlap if we graph these two curves of the various groups. So although the difference is technically detectable, there is so much overlap in those distributions that it's not really truly practical in most scenarios. So in our last few moments here before we turn to the open forum of questions, I just wanted to review the discussion topics we talked about today so far. And the first was Simpson's paradox. And we answered the questions about the inclusion or exclusion of data obfuscating a previously held conclusion, and investigated how latent variables and the decision processes may be the things we have to consider because they may change the story. For regression towards the mean, we investigated how previously noted behaviors can be a marker for the complete opposite behavior in the future. And we saw that it's a blend of chance, error, and skill that can be at play when this paradox arises. And lastly, moments ago, we just saw the difference between statistical versus practical significance and investigated the question when conclusive findings lead us to not act on a valid association. And for the heart of that discussion, we had to assess the practicality of the evidence because either it doesn't make sense or just isn't worth our time, money, and effort. So we are right at time here to switch over to our open forum. And before we dive in, I just wanted to say thank you for your attention for the last 35 minutes. And yeah, I'm excited to take some questions from the audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christopher Peter. That was fantastic and really insightful. So we have some time for some questions, so let's jump into it. Someone asked, it seems like most of the time the answer is, it depends. With that in mind, how can data scientists protect themselves from negative criticism of their analysis?
Awesome. Thank you, Gia, for that question. I think all of my students back at the Academy and CMU will be laughing if they heard that, because that is almost always the answer that a data scientist will give. But in reality, I think the best thing a data scientist could do to protect themselves from these criticisms is to realize that there's a lot of subjective choices that have to be made. Whether you're building graphics, you have to make the choice between making a bar graph or a pie chart. If you're doing machine learning, you might have to choose between a random forest versus a logistic regression. And it's really difficult to make these subjective choices. But if you were to give the same data set to 100 different people, 100 different data scientists, you'll get back with the same research question, 100 different results. So what do? I think data science is just as much of an art as it is a science. So when you make these subjective choices, you have to give yourself some constructive criticism. List the benefits of that choice, but also list the detractions and actually display why you perceive the benefits to outweigh the detractions.
Awesome. That makes sense. Thank you. Another one we have is, can you talk a little bit more about spurious conclusions? How can we avoid this?
Oh, yes. So spurious conclusions. Spurious conclusions can be reached, by making a connection between point A and point B where there really isn't a connection. Earlier we mentioned correlation versus causation. And actually on the most recent episode of the podcast, we just talked about this as an example. But you might have the claim that wearing your shoes to bed makes you wake up in the morning with a headache. And that's a spurious conclusion that's drawn by evidence, but it's really not what's going on. There may be a latent variable, and that latent variable could be a long night of drinking. And that latent variable is related to forgetting to take off your shoes before you go to bed, and also waking up with a headache. So, there's a lot of ways to avoid this, and really it's centered along that practicality of the evidence. Do we really think that there's a connection between keeping your shoes on and waking up with a headache? Is there other data that supports this? And in the worst case scenario, something that we can do easily, in most cases, is see if you can replicate those results. So if you put a lot of people to bed with their shoes on, see how many of them wake up with a headache the next morning. And that might help you avoid these spurious conclusions.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's see, I'm working my way through the questions here. A lot of them are words of praise for addressing practicality of evidence.
Okay.
Let's see here. Do we have to conclude or link our data science efforts in a company to any revenue type to make it more attractive for managers?
Wow, that's a really great question. I feel like the answer is no. And I'm really speaking from more of a responsible AI and ethical AI standpoint, because you could have a model that's really predictive and powerful and really predicts with a very high accuracy and makes the company a lot of money. But it could be very biased towards some subpopulations, or it could be misrepresenting smaller groups. And there's a lot of ethical concerns with that. So even if your analysis doesn't necessarily support an increase in revenue, it can have more impactful results that honestly matter more than just making $1. So I think that the best thing you could do is take note of those insights and obviously deliver those to your manager, to your team, and really proceed forth with the best intentions possible. And to me, that matters so much more than just making $1.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally makes sense. I have a question that I'm curious about, but before we close into that, because it looks like that would be the last question, is there anything else you want to elaborate on based on your talk?
No, I would just say that this was a really, really, really swift overview of a lot of deep topics. So if anybody else, wants to talk about this more in depth, please do feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be more than happy to chat in greater detail.
Cool. So to wrap us up, I'm curious, how did you first get interested in statistical paradoxes?
Oh my gosh, I love that. I literally just got goosebumps thinking about that. Actually goes back to when I was a kid. I can remember being like 5 years old and having a childhood aspiration to be a magician. And I think that paradoxes and magic have a lot in common, because what you see with your eyes, there has to be a logical explanation to these phenomena that you're seeing. But what appears to be is not always the case. So there's contradictory evidence that you're seeing with your own eyes, but there has to be some sort of logical explanation to it. So as I became a data scientist and a statistician and started seeing these things happen, it kind of reminds me of a numerical way of some magic that's happening behind the scenes and a little logic puzzle that you have to kind of figure out.
Awesome. I love that. I think that's a really great way to wrap us up. So that's about it for the questions. You've introduced some really, really excellent points here today. So I want to say thank you once again for Christopher Peter for his incredibly insightful talk. And thanks to all of you who joined in and tuned in live. So I want to invite you all to tune into our next Egg on Air live streams. The first one is going to be this Wednesday, October 21st, with Crystal Mon, who will discuss the crucial relationship between humans and technology involved in differential privacy as it relates to security, regulatory compliance, and provable fairness. And then we have a few more coming up next week. Be sure to tune in on October 29th with Greg Nelson, Beyond Unicorns, Designing the Workforce of the Future. And on November 10th with Nicole Alexander, the continued move to explainable AI. So look forward to those. Tune in, register. We look forward to it. Thank you, everyone, for joining in today. Take care.